Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every anxious thought you've ever had about whether someone is thinking about you has been a prison you've built with your own hands. You reach for your phone, scrolling through messages, searching for signs, clues, breadcrumbs of attention that might validate the gnawing question that has haunted you for months, perhaps years. Is he thinking about me right now? Picture this. You're lying in bed at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, your mind racing through every conversation, every glance, every moment of silence. You dissect his last text message like an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts, searching for hidden meanings in the spaces between words. You wonder if he's looking at your photos, if he's remembering that laugh you shared, if he's feeling the same electric pull that keeps you awake at night. But what if I told you that this very wondering is the source of your suffering? What if the question itself is the cage? Carl Jung once wrote about a phenomenon that most people spend their entire lives running from without ever recognizing it. He called it projection, the unconscious act of seeing in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. But there's something far more insidious happening when you find yourself consumed by thoughts of whether someone is thinking about you. You're not just projecting, you're abandoning yourself in the most fundamental way possible. Consider this paradox. The more desperately you need to know if someone is thinking about you, the less likely you are to be worth thinking about. Not because you're unworthy of love or attention, but because you've made yourself invisible to the one person whose thoughts about you matter most, yourself. While you're scanning his social media for signs of interest, while you're analyzing the timing of his responses, while you're constructing elaborate theories about his silence, you're missing the most crucial conversation of your life, the one happening inside your own mind. Jung discovered something that most people never learn. The questions we ask about others reveal everything about the questions we're afraid to ask about ourselves. When you wonder if he's thinking about you, you're really asking, am I worth thinking about? When you search for validation in his attention, you're really seeking, do I matter? When you feel anxiety about his silence, you're really confronting, am I enough? But here's where it gets disturbing. Every moment you spend wondering about his thoughts is a moment you're not present to your own. Every hour you dedicate to decoding his behavior is an hour you're not investing in understanding your own patterns. Every ounce of energy you pour into the question, is he thinking about me? Is energy stolen from the more important inquiry, what am I thinking about myself? The cruel irony is that the very act of wondering makes you less magnetic, less compelling, less worthy of the thoughts you're so desperately seeking. Think about the people who captivate you most. Do they seem consumed by whether others are thinking about them? Do they radiate the energy of someone who's constantly checking their phone, analyzing responses, constructing meaning from silence? Or do they possess something else entirely, a presence that comes from being fully engaged with their own inner world? Jung called this the difference between living from the ego and living from the self. The ego asks, what does he think of me? The self asks, what do I think of myself? The ego seeks validation from external sources. The self creates its own sense of worth. The ego is always hungry, always seeking, always wondering. The self is already whole, already complete, already enough. What if the method Jung discovered isn't about getting him to think about you more, but about needing his thoughts less? What if the secret isn't in becoming more attractive to his mind, but in becoming more attractive to your own? What if the answer to your suffering isn't found in his attention, but in the radical act of giving yourself the attention you've been begging him to provide? The question that has been tormenting you, is he thinking about me, is not the question that will set you free. There's another question. one that Jung spent his entire life exploring, one that holds the key to not just ending your suffering, but to transforming your entire relationship with yourself and others. But to find this question, you must first understand why you've been asking the wrong one all along. The method Jung discovered will change everything you think you know about love, attraction, and human connection. But it requires something most people are unwilling to give: the courage to stop running from yourself and start running toward the person you've been avoiding your entire life. The problem isn't that you're wondering if he's thinking about you. The problem is that you've been conditioned to believe that your worth depends on occupying space in someone else's mind. This conditioning runs so deep that most people never question it, never recognize it as the invisible force that shapes every relationship they'll ever have. Jung understood that what we call love is often nothing more than a sophisticated form of psychological dependence. When you find yourself obsessing over whether someone is thinking about you, you're not experiencing love. You're experiencing what he termed unconscious identification. You've unconsciously merged your sense of self with another person's attention, creating a psychological fusion that feels like intimacy, but is actually a form of spiritual imprisonment. Consider the child who learns that love is conditional, that attention must be earned, that silence equals abandonment. This child grows into an adult who believes that being thought about is the same as being loved, that occupying mental space in another person equals security, that the absence of attention signals imminent rejection. But Jung discovered something that most people never realize. This entire framework is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. The root of this misunderstanding lies in what Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that humanity has inherited over millennia. For thousands of years, survival depended on being accepted by the group, on maintaining social bonds, on ensuring that others thought favorably of you. The person who was forgotten, ignored, or cast out faced literal death. Your brain still carries these ancient programs, still interprets social rejection as a threat to your survival. But here's what makes this particularly insidious in modern relationships. You're using survival mechanisms in situations that have nothing to do with survival. When he doesn't text back immediately, your nervous system responds as if you're being abandoned by the tribe. When he seems distant, your brain interprets it as social exile. When he's quiet, your unconscious mind reads it as a death sentence. You're not just wondering if he's thinking about you. You're unconsciously believing that your life depends on it. Jung observed that most people live their entire lives without ever questioning these unconscious programs. They accept the anxiety, the constant need for reassurance, the exhausting mental loops as normal parts of romantic relationships. They never realize that they're not actually relating to another person. They're relating to their own survival fears projected onto another person. Schopenhauer, one of Jung's philosophical influences, wrote about the will to live as a blind, unconscious force that drives human behavior. But in the context of modern relationships, this will to live has become distorted into a will to be thought about. You're not seeking connection. You're seeking confirmation that you exist in another person's awareness. You're not loving. You're desperately trying to ensure your psychological survival. The French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre described a similar phenomenon in his concept of being for others. He observed that people often lose themselves in their attempts to exist in other people's consciousness, becoming so focused on how they appear to others that they forget who they actually are. When you wonder if he's thinking about you, you're experiencing this existential trap firsthand. You've made his thoughts about you more important than your own thoughts about yourself. Jung called this the participation mystique, a psychological state where you cannot distinguish between your own emotions and someone else's, where your inner world becomes dependent on external validation. In this state, you're not an individual. You're a fragment of someone else's attention. You exist only to the degree that you exist in their mind. But the most profound insight Jung offered was this: the intensity of your need to be thought about is directly proportional to how little you're thinking about yourself. Not thinking about yourself in a narcissistic way, but thinking about yourself in a conscious, present, aware way. The more disconnected you are from your own inner world, the more desperate you become for residence in someone else's. This creates what Jung identified as a complex, an autonomous psychological pattern that operates outside of conscious control. The "am I being thought about" complex becomes like a separate entity inside your psyche, constantly scanning for evidence, constantly interpreting reality through the lens of whether you're occupying mental space in another person. This complex hijacks your attention, your energy, your ability to be present to your own experience. The philosophical implications are staggering. If your sense of self depends on being thought about by others, then you don't actually have a self. You have a reflection. If your inner peace depends on another person's attention, then you don't have inner peace. You have conditional tranquility that can be shattered by a delayed text message. If your worth is determined by occupying space in someone else's mind, then you're not a person. You're a psychological parasite. Nietzsche wrote about the death of God as the moment when humanity would have to create its own meaning, its own values, its own sense of purpose. But for most people, God didn't die. He just got replaced by other people's opinions, other people's attention, other people's thoughts. You've made him your new deity, and his thoughts about you have become your new religion. The question, "Is he thinking about me?" isn't just a relationship issue. It's a spiritual crisis. It's the cry of a soul that has forgotten its own existence, that has traded its inner authority for external validation, that has chosen psychological dependence over authentic connection. But Jung discovered that this crisis contains within it the seeds of its own solution, a method so radical that it doesn't just change how you relate to others, it changes how you relate to existence itself. The moment you make another person's thoughts about you more important than your own thoughts about yourself, you set in motion a cascade of psychological consequences that will reshape every aspect of your reality. Most people never see these consequences because they unfold gradually, like a slow-acting poison that changes your neural pathways one synapse at a time. Your brain begins to rewire itself around the anticipation of his attention. Neuroscientists have discovered that the dopamine system, the same system involved in addiction, becomes activated not when you receive his attention, but when you're waiting for it. Every time you check your phone, every time you wonder if he's thinking about you, you're literally strengthening the neural pathways that make you psychologically dependent on external validation. Your brain starts to crave the uncertainty, the anxiety, the constant wondering, because it's become addicted to the chemical cocktail that accompanies hope and disappointment. This creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful form of behavioral conditioning known to science. When his attention comes unpredictably, when his thoughts about you are uncertain, your brain interprets this as a game that must be won. You become like a gambler at a slot machine, pulling the lever of your own attention over and over again, hoping for the jackpot of his consideration. But the house always wins, and in this case, the house is your own unconscious mind. The cognitive bias known as confirmation bias becomes your constant companion. You begin to interpret everything through the lens of whether he's thinking about you. A quick response means he's obsessed. A delayed response means he's playing hard to get. No response means he's testing you. His silence becomes a Rorschach test onto which you project your deepest fears and fantasies. You're no longer perceiving reality. You're perceiving your own psychological projections, disguised as insights about his mental state. But the most insidious consequence is what Jung called the shadow projection. All the qualities you refuse to acknowledge in yourself, the neediness, the desperation, the emotional hunger, get projected onto him. You convince yourself that he's the one who needs space, that he's the one who's afraid of intimacy, that he's the one who's emotionally unavailable. Meanwhile, you're completely unavailable to yourself, completely disconnected from your own emotional needs, completely out of touch with your own inner world. Your relationships become performances designed to earn thoughts rather than authentic exchanges between two conscious beings. You curate your personality to be more think-aboutable. You suppress parts of yourself that might not be mentally stimulating to him. You become a character in a story you're writing about what you think he wants to think about, rather than a real person with real thoughts, feelings, and experiences. The cultural conditioning amplifies this psychological trap. Social media has turned the question, "Is he thinking about me?" into a 24/7 surveillance operation. You can see when he was last online, when he read your message, when he liked someone else's photo. The technology that was supposed to connect us has become a microscope for examining the minutiae of other people's attention patterns. You're not just wondering if he's thinking about you, you're gathering forensic evidence to support your case for why he should be. This creates what researchers call continuous partial attention. You're never fully present to your own experience because part of your consciousness is always monitoring his potential thoughts about you. You're having dinner with friends, but you're wondering if he's thinking about you. You're at work, but you're checking your phone to see if he's reached out. You're lying in bed, but you're constructing elaborate theories about his silence. You're living multiple lives simultaneously, and none of them are your own. The paradox becomes self-perpetuating. The more you need his thoughts, the less magnetic you become. The more you wonder about his mental state, the less interesting your own mental state becomes. The more you focus on occupying space in his mind, the less space you occupy in your own awareness. You become exactly what you fear most, forgettable, because you've forgotten yourself. Jung observed that this pattern creates what he called psychological inflation. You become so identified with your need to be thought about that you lose touch with your actual identity. You're not a person, you're a question mark, floating in someone else's consciousness. You're not living your life. You're living in the imaginary space between his ears. The relationships you create from this state are fundamentally unstable because they're built on a foundation of psychological dependence rather than authentic connection. You're not choosing him, you're choosing the validation his thoughts provide. He's not choosing you, he's choosing the version of you that you've constructed to be worth thinking about. Two people performing for each other's thoughts, neither present to the actual experience of connection. But perhaps the most tragic consequence is the opportunity cost. All the energy you could have invested in developing a rich inner life, in pursuing your own interests, in building genuine self-knowledge, gets redirected into the endless task of monitoring another person's mental state. You become an expert in his psychological patterns while remaining a stranger to your own. Your intuition, your creativity, your ability to be spontaneous, all become casualties of this constant mental surveillance. You can't trust your own perceptions because you've trained your brain to interpret everything through the filter of whether it means he's thinking about you. You've become a detective investigating a crime that was never committed, searching for clues to a mystery that exists only in your own mind. The question, "Is he thinking about me?" has become a full-time job, and you've been working overtime without pay, benefits, or the possibility of retirement. But Jung discovered that the exit door has been there all along, hidden behind the very psychological mechanisms that keep you trapped. The rebellion begins with a single, radical act. the conscious decision to become more interested in your own thoughts than in his thoughts about you. This isn't positive thinking or self-help platitudes. This is a fundamental revolution in how you relate to your own consciousness. Jung called this process individuation, and it requires something most people are terrified to attempt: the courage to meet yourself without the mirror of another person's attention. The method Jung discovered starts with what he termed active imagination, a practice that involves turning your attention inward with the same intensity you've been directing outward. Instead of wondering, what is he thinking about me right now? You begin asking, what am I thinking about myself right now? Instead of analyzing his silence, you start analyzing your own internal dialogue. Instead of seeking evidence of his interest, you start gathering evidence of your own fascinating inner world. But here's what makes this rebellion so powerful. The moment you genuinely become absorbed in your own thoughts, feelings, and experiences, you automatically become more magnetic to others. Not because you're trying to attract attention, but because you're no longer desperately needing it. Jung observed that people are drawn to those who seem to have access to something within themselves that others lack: presence, self-knowledge, inner authority. Consider the historical examples of people who captivated others, not through neediness, but through self-possession. Virginia Woolf didn't wonder if her lovers were thinking about her. She was too busy exploring the depths of her own consciousness and translating those discoveries into literature. Frida Kahlo didn't analyze Diego Rivera's attention patterns. She was consumed by her own artistic vision and emotional truth. These individuals became magnets not because they needed to be thought about, but because they were genuinely fascinating to themselves. The rebellion requires what Jung called withdrawing projections, consciously recognizing that your obsession with his thoughts is actually a displaced obsession with your own self-worth. Every time you catch yourself wondering if he's thinking about you, you redirect that energy toward a more revolutionary question: what do I think about myself? This isn't narcissism. It's the basic requirement for psychological health. Jung discovered that most people are afraid to be alone with their own thoughts because they've never learned to be good company for themselves. They've outsourced their inner dialogue to other people's potential opinions about them. The rebellion involves reclaiming your internal conversation, becoming curious about your own psychological patterns, developing a relationship with your own unconscious mind. The practice becomes concrete through what Jung called shadow work, the process of recognizing and integrating the parts of yourself you've been hiding in order to be more think-about-able. You begin to ask yourself, what aspects of my personality am I suppressing to maintain his interest? What parts of my authentic self am I afraid to reveal? What would I do, think, or feel if I weren't constantly monitoring his mental state? This process often reveals shocking truths. You might discover that you don't actually like him that much. You like the idea of being liked by him. You might realize that you don't even know who you are when you're not performing for someone else's thoughts. You might find that your entire personality has been constructed around being worthy of mental attention, rather than expressing your authentic nature. The rebellion involves what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, learning to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what he's thinking while simultaneously discovering what you're thinking. This creates what he termed the transcendent function, a psychological capacity that emerges when you stop trying to resolve the uncertainty and start using it as fuel for self-discovery. The most radical aspect of this rebellion is the recognition that you don't need to be thought about to exist. Your worth isn't determined by occupying space in someone else's mind. Your value isn't contingent on another person's attention. Your identity doesn't depend on external validation. This realization isn't just intellectually liberating, it's spiritually revolutionary. Jung observed that people who successfully complete this rebellion often experience what he called the return of the soul, a profound reconnection with their own inner life that had been sacrificed to the altar of other people's opinions. They stop being psychological refugees, seeking asylum in other people's thoughts, and become citizens of their own consciousness. The practical application involves what Jung called active imagination exercises. Instead of imagining what he might be thinking about you, you begin imagining conversations with different aspects of yourself. You dialogue with your fears, your desires, your creative impulses, your shadow qualities. You develop the same psychological intimacy with yourself that you've been desperately seeking from him. This rebellion doesn't happen overnight. It requires what Jung called the patience of the alchemist, the willingness to slowly transform the lead of psychological dependence into the gold of self-possession. Every time you choose self-reflection over other obsession, every time you choose internal dialogue over external validation, every time you choose your own thoughts over his potential thoughts, you're participating in this ancient alchemical process. The irony is that the moment you stop needing his thoughts, you become infinitely more worthy of them. But by that point, you've discovered something far more valuable than his attention, your own. You've found the treasure that was always there, hidden beneath the rubble of your own abandoned self-awareness. The rebellion culminates in a startling realization. The question, "Is he thinking about me?" was never really about him at all. It was about you, asking yourself if you're worth thinking about. And the answer, Jung discovered, depends entirely on whether you're actually thinking about yourself. The ultimate truth that Jung discovered will shatter everything you thought you knew about love, connection, and human relationships. It's not that he's thinking about you or not thinking about you. It's not that you should or shouldn't wonder about his thoughts. The ultimate truth is this: the very capacity to wonder about another person's thoughts is the same capacity that allows you to create the deepest, most authentic connection possible, but only when that capacity is turned inward first. Jung called this the paradox of individuation. The more completely you become yourself, the more capable you become of truly meeting another person. The more fascinating you become to yourself, the more genuinely fascinating you become to others. The more present you are to your own inner world, the more present you can be to someone else's actual presence, rather than your fantasies about their thoughts. But here's the paradigm shift that changes everything. What you've been seeking in his thoughts about you, validation, security, proof of your worth, already exists within your own consciousness. You've been looking for yourself in his mind, and you were always right there, waiting to be discovered in your own awareness. The treasure you've been hunting for in his attention has been buried in your own psyche all along. This realization reveals the cosmic joke of human relationships. We spend our lives trying to see ourselves reflected in other people's eyes, never realizing that we are the very consciousness looking through our own eyes. We seek our identity in other people's thoughts about us, never recognizing that we are the thinker of our own thoughts. We want to exist in someone else's mind, never understanding that we are the mind in which our own existence unfolds. Jung discovered that what we call love is often just two people using each other as mirrors, each desperately trying to see themselves reflected in the other's attention. But real love, what Jung called conscious love, happens when two people who have learned to see themselves clearly choose to share that clarity with each other. It's not about being thought about, it's about thinking together. It's not about occupying space in someone else's mind. It's about creating a shared space where two minds can meet without losing themselves. The method Jung developed doesn't make him think about you more. It makes his thoughts about you irrelevant to your sense of self. It doesn't increase your chances of being in his mind. It decreases your need to be there. It doesn't make you more attractive to him. It makes you so attractive to yourself that his opinion becomes just one voice in a chorus of self-appreciation that you've learned to conduct. This is the ultimate rebellion against the psychological slavery of needing external validation. You become so genuinely interested in your own thoughts, feelings, dreams, and experiences that other people's mental states become fascinating rather than necessary. You stop being a psychological vampire, feeding on other people's attention, and become a psychological sun, generating your own light, warmth, and energy. The transformation is profound. Instead of wondering, is he thinking about me? You start wondering, what am I thinking about this moment? Instead of analyzing his behavior for signs of interest, you start analyzing your own patterns for signs of growth. Instead of seeking evidence of his attention, you start gathering evidence of your own aliveness, creativity, and depth. But the most revolutionary aspect of this transformation is that it makes genuine intimacy possible for the first time. When you're not desperately needing someone's thoughts, you can actually listen to their words. When you're not analyzing their behavior for signs of interest, you can actually see who they are. When you're not performing for their attention, you can actually be present to the experience of connection. Jung realized that the question, is he thinking about me, was never really a question about him. It was a question about you, asking yourself if you're worth thinking about. And the answer depends entirely on whether you've developed the capacity to think about yourself with curiosity, compassion, and genuine interest. The ultimate truth is that you don't need to be thought about to exist. You don't need to occupy space in someone else's mind to matter. You don't need external validation to be worthy of love. You are the consciousness through which all thoughts, including thoughts about being thought about, arise. You are the awareness in which all experiences, including the experience of wondering about someone's mental state, occur. This realization doesn't diminish the beauty of being genuinely appreciated by another person. It makes that appreciation infinitely more meaningful because it's no longer necessary for your survival. It doesn't make relationships less important. It makes them more authentic because they're built on choice rather than psychological dependence. The method Jung discovered is ultimately about coming home to yourself. It's about recognizing that the very consciousness that's capable of wondering about another person's thoughts is the same consciousness that's capable of creating art, experiencing beauty, solving problems, feeling compassion, and connecting authentically with others. You've been using this incredible capacity to torture yourself with questions about external validation when you could be using it to explore the infinite richness of your own inner world. Stop wondering when he's thinking about you. Start wondering about the miracle that you're capable of thinking at all. Stop seeking your reflection in his thoughts. Start recognizing that you are the light by which all reflections are seen. Stop trying to exist in someone else's mind. Start fully inhabiting your own consciousness. The ultimate truth is that you are not a question waiting to be answered by someone else's attention. You are the answer to the question of what it means to be fully, authentically, courageously yourself. And that answer doesn't depend on whether anyone else is thinking about it.